Right now, somewhere in the world, a crisis is ending. But here's the disturbing truth. The people suffering through it have absolutely no say in when it's officially over. Someone else is making that call. Someone with power. Someone with an agenda.
And what they decide will determine whether millions get help or are left behind.
So who are these people? And why should you care? Stay with me, because what I'm about to reveal will change how you see every news headline for the rest of your life. Asterisk. I've spent the last 15 years studying crisis management, humanitarian response, and the machinery of international policy. I've consulted with NGOs, spoken with survivors, and watched from the inside as decisions get made in rooms most people will never see. And I can tell you this with absolute certainty. The end of a crisis is never just about the crisis itself. It's about politics. It's about money. It's about narratives that serve the powerful. And most disturbingly, it's rarely about the people who are actually living through the nightmare. Think about the last major crisis you remember. Maybe it was a natural disaster. Maybe a pandemic. Maybe a conflict. Do you remember when the media stopped covering it? When the donations dried up? When everyone seemed to move on? That wasn't an accident. That was a decision. And someone made it. Asterisk, but here's what's even more shocking. There's a playbook for this. A hidden formula that governments, media organizations, and international bodies use to decide when a crisis gets downgraded, deprioritized, or declared finished. And once you understand this formula, you'll see it everywhere. You'll recognize the patterns. The signals? The exact moment when the world decides to look away, and some of those signals? They're happening right now with crises you think are still front-page news. Asterisk, let me introduce you to the invisible architects of crisis endings. First, we have governments. These are often the most obvious players, but their motivations are more complex than you'd think. When a government declares a crisis over, it's making a calculated statement. It's saying, we've handled this. We're in control. You can trust us again. This isn't just about public health or safety. It's about political survival. Take the COVID-19 pandemic. Different countries declared the emergency over at vastly different times, even though the virus didn't respect borders. Why? Because each government was balancing epidemiological data against economic pressure, public fatigue, and upcoming elections. The United States ended its public health emergency in May 2023, but was the virus gone? Of course not. The decision wasn't medical. It was political and economic. Then we have international organizations. The World Health Organization, the United Nations, the International Red Cross, these bodies carry enormous weight. When the WHO declares a public health emergency of international concern over, that signals to the world that resources can be redirected. Funding shifts. Attention moves. But these organizations face their own pressures. They answer to member states. They operate on limited budgets. They must choose which crises get priority. In 2016, the WHO declared the Zika virus outbreak no longer constituted an international emergency. But babies were still being born with microcephaly. Families were still devastated. The crisis didn't end for them. It ended on paper in a conference room in Geneva, because the organization needed to reallocate resources to other emerging threats. Next, we have the media. This is where things get really interesting. The news cycle has its own brutal logic. A crisis explodes onto our screens with 24/7 coverage, expert panels, and breathless updates. Then, gradually, the stories get shorter. They move from the front page to page 5. From the evening news to a brief mention. Then nothing. This isn't because the crisis is over. It's because the media has decided the story is no longer novel enough to capture attention. Journalists call this compassion fatigue. But it's more accurate to call it profit fatigue. Crises that don't generate clicks or viewers don't get coverage. And without coverage, the public perception shifts. If we're not seeing it, it must be over, right? Wrong. The Syrian conflict is a perfect example. For years, it dominated headlines. Refugee crises, chemical weapons, heartbreaking images of suffering children. Then, gradually, coverage declined. Not because the situation improved, but because the media moved on. The war continued. People kept dying. but in the public consciousness. It had ended simply because we stopped hearing about it. And finally, we have the most insidious player of all: economic interests. Corporations, industries, and financial markets that are affected by crisis declarations. When a region is declared safe after a natural disaster, insurance companies can reduce payouts. When a health emergency is declared over, pharmaceutical companies can shift focus to more profitable ventures. When a conflict is deemed stable, businesses can resume operations without public scrutiny. Follow the money. And you'll understand why some crises end exactly when they do. Asterisk. Now let me show you how these decisions actually get made. There are three primary mechanisms, and once you understand them, you'll never look at crisis reporting the same way again. Mechanism number 1: statistical thresholds. This sounds scientific, but it's deeply flawed. Organizations set numerical benchmarks. When cases fall below X, when deaths drop below Y, when displaced persons return above Z%, the crisis is declared over or downgraded. The problem? These thresholds are often arbitrary. Who decided that 100 cases per week means an outbreak is under control, but 101 means it's still a crisis? These numbers create the illusion of objectivity, but they're based on political feasibility, not human reality. During the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, international attention surged when cases spiked and famous doctors contracted the disease. The moment numbers began declining, the countdown to crisis over began. But communities were still devastated. Healthcare systems were still collapsed. Survivors faced lifelong health issues and social stigma. Yet, because the numbers hit a magic threshold, the world moved on. Mechanism number 2: narrative control. This is where storytelling becomes weaponized. Every crisis has a narrative arc that the public expects. There's the shocking emergence, the escalating threat, the heroic response, and finally, the resolution. Media and governments alike understand this. They know that audiences crave closure. So they provide it. Whether or not reality cooperates. Think about natural disasters. The earthquake hits. Devastation. Rescue efforts. Rebuilding begins. Success story. Crisis over. But what about the people still living in temporary shelters 2 years later? What about the communities that never fully recovered? They don't fit the narrative, so they disappear from the story. Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans in 2005. By 2007, most media coverage suggested the city was back. The Superdome reopened. Tourism returned. But tens of thousands of residents never came home. Entire neighborhoods remained abandoned. The lower Ninth Ward was still devastated. The crisis continued for those people, but the official narrative said it was over. This narrative control serves everyone in power. It allows governments to claim victory. It lets media move to the next story. It permits businesses to resume normal operations. Everyone benefits except the people still suffering. Mechanism number 3: mandate expiration. International responses to crises operate on mandates and budgets with fixed timelines. A humanitarian operation might be funded for 18 months. A peacekeeping mission might be authorized for 2 years. When that time runs out, unless there's compelling reason and political will to extend it, the mission ends, not because the crisis is resolved, but because the paperwork says it's time to go. I've seen this firsthand in post-conflict zones. International workers leave not because peace has been established, but because their contracts ended. Funding dries up not because needs have been met, but because donor attention has shifted. The crisis calendar operates independently of the actual crisis. If this is opening your eyes to how crisis decisions really work, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now. This channel is dedicated to pulling back the curtain on systems of power that affect your life every single day. We're building a community of people who want to understand the real mechanisms driving world events. Don't just watch. Join us. Subscribe. And let's keep exposing these hidden structures together. Now, let's talk about what happens when a crisis is declared over prematurely or for the wrong reasons. Because this isn't just theoretical. Real lives hang in the balance. Consequence number 1: resource withdrawal. The moment a crisis is officially downgraded, funding evaporates. NGOs pull out. Government aid programs shut down. Medical supplies stop flowing. This creates a secondary crisis that's often worse than the original. Haiti is a tragic example. After the devastating 2010 earthquake, billions in aid poured in. International attention was intense. But within a few years, as the crisis was deemed over, that support vanished. Projects were left incomplete. Infrastructure remained broken. And when Hurricane Matthew hit in 2016, the country was even more vulnerable because the supposed recovery had been declared finished long before it actually was. The people of Haiti didn't decide their crisis was over. Donors did. International organizations did. And when the next disaster struck, those same people paid the price for a premature declaration they had no part in making. Consequence number 2, public awareness collapse. Once the official word comes down that a crisis has ended, public attention evaporates almost overnight. This isn't just about media coverage. It affects individual behavior too. Donations stop. Volunteer interest disappears. Political pressure on leaders to act vanishes. This creates a vicious cycle. Without public awareness, there's no political incentive to maintain support. Without support, conditions deteriorate. But because the crisis is officially over, new problems are treated as separate issues rather than ongoing consequences of the original crisis. Look at the opioid epidemic in the United States. There was a period where it was treated as a national crisis, declared as such by the government in 2017. Resources were allocated. Attention was focused. Then, gradually, even though deaths continued to climb, even though communities remained devastated, the intensity of the response diminished. Not because the problem was solved, but because the crisis narrative had run its course in the public consciousness, new crises emerged. COVID-19, political upheaval, economic uncertainty, and the opioid epidemic, still killing tens of thousands annually, faded into the background. The crisis didn't end. We just stopped treating it like one. Consequence number 3, survivor invisibility. This might be the most personally devastating impact. When a crisis is declared over, the people still suffering become invisible. Their ongoing struggles are reframed as personal problems rather than collective crisis. They're told, in effect, to move on because everyone else has. Veterans returning from declared ended wars face this constantly. The conflict is over officially. Troops have come home. But the veteran dealing with PTSD, chronic pain, and traumatic brain injury is still living in a war zone inside their own body. Yet resources are cut. Support diminishes. Because the crisis, according to the official record, has ended. Survivors of sexual assault and abuse face similar invisibility. Movements like Me Too create moments of crisis awareness. Attention surges. Promises are made. Then the moment passes. The crisis is declared addressed. Policies have changed, people say. But for survivors still dealing with trauma, still fighting for justice, still facing systemic barriers, the crisis has never ended. They're just no longer part of the official story. This is the cruelest aspect of premature crisis endings. They don't just withdraw resources. They invalidate ongoing suffering. They tell people their pain no longer counts because the calendar has moved on. Asterisk. So what's the solution? How should we actually decide when a crisis ends? Let me propose an alternative framework, one that centers the people most affected, rather than the institutions managing the response. Principle number 1, survivor-defined metrics. Instead of arbitrary thresholds set in distant offices, let the people experiencing the crisis define what recovery looks like. This sounds obvious, but it's revolutionary in practice. What if, instead of declaring a health emergency over when cases hit a certain number, we asked healthcare workers and patients when they felt the system could handle the disease load? What if, instead of declaring a region safe after conflict when violence drops below a statistical threshold, we asked residents when they felt secure enough to rebuild their lives? This approach has been tried in small-scale projects with remarkable results. Community-based recovery programs that let survivors set the goals and timelines consistently outperform top-down approaches. Why? Because the people living through the crisis understand it better than anyone watching from outside. Principle number 2, longitudinal assessment. Crises don't operate on convenient timelines. Recovery isn't linear. A region might seem stable for months, then deteriorate rapidly. A health crisis might have waves and resurgences. An economic collapse might take a generation to truly resolve. We need to move away from declaration moments and toward continuous assessment. This means maintaining baseline monitoring and support systems that can scale up when needed rather than binary on-off crisis switches. Japan's approach to earthquake preparedness offers a model. Rather than declaring areas safe or unsafe, they maintain constant monitoring, regular drills, and flexible response systems. The crisis of potential earthquakes never truly ends, so they've built their society to live with ongoing vigilance rather than false certainty. Principle number 3. Transparent decision-making. Every time a crisis is officially downgraded or declared over, that decision should be accompanied by public documentation of who made the call, based on what criteria, and accounting for which stakeholders were consulted. This creates accountability. It prevents purely political declarations from masquerading as technical assessments. And it allows affected communities to challenge decisions that don't reflect their reality. Some humanitarian organizations have begun implementing this kind of transparency in their own operations. They publish exit strategies that are tied to clear, measurable outcomes and include mechanisms for community input. It's not perfect, but it's a start. Principle number 4. Resource graduation, not termination. Instead of the cliff edge model where support vanishes the moment a crisis is declared over, we need graduated withdrawal tied to actual capacity building. Think of it like physical therapy after an injury. You don't go from intensive care to complete independence overnight. There are stages. Reduced support. Monitored independence. Periodic check-ins. The same should apply to crisis response. This costs more in the short term, but it's vastly more effective and humane in the long term. It prevents the cycle of crisis, response, premature declaration of success, secondary crisis, and renewed intervention that's so common now. Now. You might be thinking this is all very interesting, but what can I actually do about it? I'm not running the WHO or making government policy. Fair question. But you have more power than you realize. First, become a critical consumer of crisis narratives. When you see headlines declaring a crisis over, ask yourself, who made that determination? Who benefits from that declaration? Whose voices are missing from the story? Start looking for follow-up reporting from affected regions. Seek out perspectives from people on the ground. Organizations like Doctors Without Borders, local journalism collectives, and survivor advocacy groups often continue covering situations long after mainstream media has moved on. Support them. Share their work. Keep those stories alive. Second, make your support sustainable rather than reactive. Crisis donations spike during the acute phase when media coverage is intense, then disappear. But ongoing support is often more valuable. Consider setting up small monthly donations to organizations working on long-term recovery rather than making one-time contributions during the dramatic moment. This does two things. It provides stable funding that organizations can plan around, and it keeps you connected to the issue, making you less likely to forget about it when the headlines disappear. Third, contact your elected representatives and demand better accountability. Ask them how they determine when crisis funding should be withdrawn. Push for legislation that requires community input in crisis decision-making. Support politicians who prioritize survivor voices over bureaucratic convenience. Your representatives respond to constituent pressure. If enough people demand better crisis management frameworks, policy will change. But it requires sustained engagement, not just reaction to the crisis of the moment. Fourth, practice sustainable attention. This is perhaps the hardest but most important. We live in an age of constant crisis, and compassion fatigue is real. You can't maintain maximum alarm about everything all the time. That's not healthy or effective. But you can choose a few issues that matter deeply to you and commit to following them for the long haul. Not just during the peak media moment, but through the long, unglamorous work of actual recovery. Become the person who remembers, who asks about it months and years later, who doesn't let the story die just because it's no longer trending. This kind of sustained witness is powerful. It keeps pressure on institutions. It validates the experiences of people still suffering. And it changes how you understand the world. Asterisk before I wrap this up. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person this channel is for. Someone who doesn't just want surface-level explanations, but wants to understand the deep structures that shape our world. Hit that subscribe button. Ring the notification bell. Because we're going to keep diving into these hidden systems, these unspoken power dynamics, these questions that don't have easy answers but desperately need to be asked. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. Because understanding who decides when a crisis ends is the first step toward building a system where those decisions are made more justly, more transparently, and more humanely. Here's the truth I want you to walk away with. A crisis doesn't end when someone in power says it does. A crisis ends when the people who live through it can rebuild their lives with dignity, safety, and hope. Everything else is just paperwork. The next time you see a headline declaring a crisis over, I want you to pause. Think about who made that decision. Think about who might still be suffering beyond the boundaries of that official declaration. And ask yourself, what can I do to make sure their voices aren't forgotten? Because that's how change happens. Not through grand declarations from distant institutions, but through ordinary people refusing to look away. Through communities that hold power accountable. Through sustained attention that outlasts the news cycle. You are part of that equation. Your attention matters. Your voice matters. Your choices about where to direct your resources and your concern, they matter. The system that decides when crises end is broken. But systems are made of people. And people can change. It starts with understanding. It continues with action. And it succeeds when enough of us refuse to accept that someone else gets to decide when suffering is officially over. So stay informed. Stay engaged. Stay human. And together we can build a world where crisis management serves the people in crisis, not the institutions observing from a safe distance. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And thank you for being willing to ask the hard questions. I'll see you in the next video.